where I was, and the doctor was sitting on my right, and across the table was the door, and 30, 35 people, usually mothers with their young kids, basically waiting to see him for a consultation. And I would remember after a few patients, the person at the door, by the time they got to the door and then walked around the table and sat next to him to get their pulse read, which is how he diagnosed them, he would whisper to me exactly what was wrong with them. And I was just blown away, and I'd ask him, how he did this. And it was by the color of their skin or the way they walked in or, the sound of their voice. And it just opened up this whole concept of wellness, and symptoms and signs, and this sort of the traditional understanding of, it's not just, $1,000 and $1 million medical equipment that we diagnose with, but there's sort of these ancient principles that we can find out a lot about health and well-being just from insight and, having attention. And so that blew me away. And obviously that made me fascinated to learn more about it.
Can you talk to me a little bit about insight? Because you hear the word, it's becoming a little bit more popular, especially around mindfulness, and there's insight meditation, but there's also the teaching and wisdom of insight. From your understanding and what you've learned, what's that actually mean?
Well, basically, I believe it comes back to this sort of dichotomy, I guess, between Eastern and Western ways of looking at things. So in the West, the way we find out information is we start on the gross level, the superficial physical body, and then we try and peer into deeper levels. And what science is finding is that, the senses are more subtle than the physical body, and then emotions are more subtle than that, the feeling level. And of course, the Eastern tradition has always been the exact reverse. They've understood that at the basis of all of life, including the physical body and the mind, emotions, is a non-physical field of any energy and intelligence, whether it's called the consciousness or pure consciousness or spirit or the Akashic field, many, many different names. But basically there's an intelligence that underlies all of life. And so the deeper the level of experience or the deeper levels of nature that you can experience life with, the more profound those insights, for want of a better word. So it's where these, heightened intuition, heightened perception, very clear insights come from. And the East, they don't understand them as something abnormal or miracles as we do in the West. It's only that we think of them as miracles because we've got this Western view that, there's mind and there's body, and anything we can't analyze under a microscope is somehow different or strange, whereas they see it as just the natural expression of being able to contact this deeper field of life. And so we humans have a nervous system that, if it's refined enough, can actually know anything. And that's what insight is. It's just that sort of being able to see what most people can't see through the eyes.
Mark, with what you do and how it's done in Eastern traditions, as far as I know, that this insight and the consciousness and, mindfulness, which we'll talk about later, and meditation, it's not something you can just read about, that it actually needs to be practiced.
Yeah, experienced.
And that some of that practice takes real discipline. Can you talk a little bit about, in Southeast Asia and, over in India, which I know you've been there quite a bit, what do those practices look like? Like how do the gurus and those people that you see firsthand, what are the practices?
Well, there's many and varied, and that's, I think, the nature of life. You go through different continents and different traditions. There's a whole number of practices, and some are based on what we could call wisdom, and some are maybe based on ignorance. So I remember a great teacher of mine, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who actually brought Tiamat to the West. He talks about knowledge and the loss of knowledge, and he says, with time, all knowledge gets lost or it gets fragmented or watered down. It's a bit like Chinese whispers, You tell enough people and they interpret it according to their understanding, and then they tell the next person. Over time, it's completely different to the original purity of knowledge. And so that's why we get such sort of diverse wisdom throughout the world, if you like. So even in India, which is known as the land of Veda or Vedic wisdom, you've got a whole sort of spread of different traditions. So even meditation, there's many different types. But essentially going back, I believe it's this meditation is the key technique. We need to close the eyes and go within and enliven this inner source of, whether it's called consciousness or spirit or the unified field. That's the basis of it all. So just doing yoga, physical postures of yoga, or trying to control the breath within themselves, they don't access that field. But it's like watering the root of a tree to nourish all the branches and the leaves. So that's, I think, closing the eyes is really the first and central step to all of them.
And so in Western life, that's almost the hardest thing to get someone to do for some bizarre reason, to like go sit down with some stillness without a phone and actually just close your eyes and start a connection within becomes almost impossible and weird.
Yeah, well, I think there's two reasons for that. And one is I have a colleague, she's Australian, but she now lives in the US, and she says, because she deals with a lot of the busy corporates, and she says we worship at the altar of activity.
Yeah.
And that's, again, our Western view of seeing the world. Because we have this materialistic view of the world, then connected to that is more activity, and all our self-development sort of programs and teachers over the last decade or two, it's all about activity. The more you do, your better your outcomes. Got to work hard, got to be disciplined. Whereas that's the exact opposite to success from an Eastern perspective, and indeed meditation. And this is why the advent of mindfulness and things over the last few years has been really good, because it's taken us a step beyond what traditionally most people see as meditation, which is this very arduous, disciplined, difficult procedure. You've got to somehow control this mind with all these thoughts. You've got to try and control them. Whereas mindfulness, of course, is not to control them, is just let them be, passively be aware of them. And that's exactly what Maharishi, his central message was to the West, is that meditation is not difficult. It's actually the most easiest thing in the world, because the mind by nature wants to go to a field of more charm, more bliss. And he even says, you're in a library and you're reading a book, and if the book's not that exciting and someone turns on some beautiful music, your mind will naturally be drawn to the music because it's more charming, it's more blissful. The music becomes a bit dull and boring, but some kids start playing outside and they have that beautiful, innocent laughter. Your mind is naturally drawn to it. And so it's just that in our recent history, we haven't had the techniques and the understanding of how to take the mind to more charming and blissful levels of the mind. But when we do, it's easy. It's actually effortless, and it's not difficult at all. So once, I think, even busy people understand that and get an experience of that they don't have to fight it. It's not something they've got to sort of push or work hard at or try and discipline their mind, then that creates the shift for them.
Yeah, and I think everything, it seems like in modern life too, everything's pushing us away from that state, like the busyness and the feeling of productivity when we fill moments, and that's the only way you're going to feel productive is by doing more, not being more, and sort of losing sight of what that actually means. But then also I think losing sight of how do you actually do that and still feel fulfilled and part of modern life, because modern life's about more. It's an interesting dialogue, I think, and I think you're doing it better than most to explain how simple it can actually be.
Well, I was just thinking before butting in, but I think you're one of the really great experts in that area too, that whole conversation. So, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think we just got to keep I think that all the knowledge you can have in the world means nothing unless we can find a way to put it in an applicable form for people today to take and use. That's the key. That's the unlock. It's not how much knowledge you know or how much wisdom you've got. If no one can use it, if my 10-year-old boy can't use it, it means nothing.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I always come back to Mother Nature. That's really my defining principle. Whenever there's any confusion or there's a question about anything, even recommendations I give, it's like, how did Mother Nature design it? Because we look at the world and there is an intelligence with whatever we call it. The seasons come at a certain time, a baby's born and it grows according to these particular laws. And there's a great saying that music is the space between the notes. If all you have is the notes without the space, it's just a jumbled mess. And our life is exactly the same. And that principle from Mother Nature is rest and activity. And so all the dynamism of life and the seasons and our world is underpinned by rest. Night is to day, winter is to summer. And so without rest, there is no activity. And so the more deep, the more dynamic the rest, the more profound and dynamic the activity. And so we even see it in sport these days. Elite sport over the last decade has been flipped on its head, where the primary focus for athletes is the recovery phase. Unless you can recover and rest, then you can't perform the next week. And so broadening it out, life is exactly the same. We need these periods of deep rest, non-activity, so that not only is our activity more profound and dynamic, but it's actually more enjoyable and blissful, which is what we're all here to experience.
I think it's beautifully put, and it makes so much sense because it's, and then that what you're saying, Mark, connects that. If you look at a leadership, or as you said in sporting environments, then that connects to performance. Like when you got renewal and you're energized and you got a clear mind and you're in the present moment, you're going to perform pretty good as opposed to burned out and busy. Yeah, that's not a performance state. So I think what you're saying is really spot on, mate. I want to get into how you got into Ayurveda and what that looked like for you in terms of how you studied it. Was that done in Australia or was that done overseas?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Actually, it was. I was still playing football. I was at Hawthorn, and the guy who taught me meditation 4 years earlier gave me a book, and it was about sport. It was about sporting performance, but it was from an Ayurvedic perspective. And so it had these chapters on, the nasal breathing and living in tune with the daily cycles and how there were different body types. So a diet for one person was actually not suitable for a diet for someone else with a different body type. And it just made so much sense to me. This little light bulb kept going off in my head because I was still studying. I was doing an honours degree in Western science at that time and doing all this research on antioxidants and free radicals and thinking I was, this really smart dude. And, of course, at the end of that, I was as confused as everyone else because from the Western perspective, every month there was a new study that came out that told you something the exact opposite of the week before. But this book was just like, it just made so much sense to me, and that's what Ayurveda, I think, was. It just resonates because it's based on the laws of nature. It does resonate, this sort of truth. So as soon as I finished football, as I said, went to Southeast Asia and started to have some practical experience of Ayurveda. Worked with some Indian doctors over there. But then I came back to Melbourne. There was a private college down in Melbourne where I did a 2-year full-time course in Maharishi Ayurveda. And then I was really lucky. It was just one of those sort of cosmic sort of things where as soon as I finished that 2-year course, there was a husband and wife team. They were sort of an international touring team of Ayurvedic doctors came to Australia to do a sort of series of consultations, and they were just profoundly popular. They were just really personable, had great knowledge, and so I sort of became their national coordinator and travelled around with them for about another 2 years. So sitting in on all their consultations, basically living with them, observing how they live their life. And it was a bit, I always explain it, it's a bit like, you're a marketing or a self-development person, and